Welcome to Debt Matters. Right now, at this exact moment, there is £26 billion completely frozen in the UK economy.
Yeah, it is not lost. It is not unearned. It is just sitting in the wrong bank accounts.
Exactly. Because massive corporations are treating their smallest suppliers like, well, like a free overdraft facility.
Right.
And if you are listening to this and you manage a business, or if you handle credit control, you are already intimately familiar with this reality. You know, the daily grinding friction of it.
Oh, absolutely. It is that constant checking of your accounting software.
Yeah, the polite follow-up emails that get ignored, and that delicate dance of trying to demand your money without somehow angering the massive client who owes it to you. It completely clogs up the gears of commerce.
It really does. And the Department for Business and Trade recently put some very stark numbers to this problem. When we look at the scale of late payments, it is actively dragging down the broader economy.
What did they find?
Their publication estimates that late payments cost the UK economy almost £11 billion every single year.
11 billion. I mean, that is money that could be going into hiring or expanding operations or research and development.
Exactly, just vanishing into this void of waiting. And the human and operational cost is even clearer. Around 14,000 businesses are forced to close each year directly as a result of these delays.
Oh, wow. 14,000.
Yeah. That $26 billion in owed invoices represents vital working capital completely frozen. It prevents smaller enterprises from taking on new orders because they literally cannot afford the materials.
Right, or the payroll required to fulfill them.
Exactly, all while waiting on an overdue invoice from a larger client.
So our mission today is to connect the dots on the UK government's intended late payment legislation. We want to understand the practical changes to payment culture, accountability, and the commercial recovery landscape.
Keeping in mind, of course, that these rules are pending parliamentary time.
Right, meaning they require formal legislative scheduling before becoming active law. But the government has outlined a clear policy direction intended to address that £26 billion backlog by changing the structural mechanics of how businesses pay each other.
Yeah, because if you want to stop a backlog like that from forming, you have to look at the mechanism of the delay itself.
Which brings us to the intended method for stopping this, which is drawing a hard line at 60 days.
A maximum payment term of 60 days between businesses is the core proposal here, with only very limited exemptions. The goal is to establish a hard ceiling.
To target the deliberate treasury strategies used by large buyers.
Precisely. In a high-interest rate environment, holding on to £100 million in payables for an extra 30 days yields a massive return in a corporate bank account.
Right, so the large corporation earns the interest, while the 10-person supplier unknowingly acts as an unsecured zero-interest lender.
Yeah, absorbing all the burden of cash flow management, the 60-day limit is designed to shut that specific arbitrage strategy down.
Wait, I thought there was talk about an even tighter deadline. Was a 45-day limit on the table at one point?
There was, yeah. There was consideration of bringing that maximum term down to 45 days. But the government has stated they are not taking that reduction forward right now.
Why not?
Well, the feedback during consultations highlighted the structural realities of complex supply chains, particularly those dealing with international shipping or highly technical goods. Large buyers argued they physically need time to receive, inspect, and verify massive shipments before authorizing payment.
Oh, I see. So forcing a 45-day rule across the board could inadvertently lead to buyers simply rejecting invoices entirely on day 44.
Exactly, just to buy themselves more time for inspection.
Yeah.
Establishing a firm, enforceable 60-day baseline across the board is the immediate priority.
Though 45 days could be revisited in the future, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, let me push back on this 60-day baseline for a second. Because, a rule is just a suggestion if nobody enforces it.
That is very true.
If I run a 10-person design agency and my biggest client, like a massive multinational retailer, just decides to ignore the 60-day rule, what am I realistically going to do? I am not going to bite the hand that feeds me.
Right. The power imbalance you were describing makes enforcement incredibly difficult for the smaller party under the current framework. But the intended legislation addresses that exact pushback by upgrading the Small Business Commissioner.
Okay.
Connecting the 60-day rule to an actual enforcement mechanism is what gives the legislation teeth. The commissioner is slated to gain robust new powers to actively investigate poor payment practices.
Investigate and adjudicate, right?
Exactly. Adjudicate disputes outside of the lengthy traditional court process. They will also have the power to actually fine businesses that persistently pay suppliers late.
Which is huge. If we look at the reality for a credit controller right now, If a massive client refuses to pay, the main option is to initiate legal action.
Right, you send a formal letter before action from a solicitor.
Yeah, and if that fails, you issue a claim in the courts. You pay thousands in legal fees, you wait months for a hearing, and you permanently destroy the commercial relationship. You are saying this adjudication process bypasses that entirely.
It completely removes the barrier of expensive court action. Smaller businesses gain a highly practical, accessible route to challenge non-payment without needing to fund a protracted legal battle.
But if you are listening to this and you run that small agency, you are probably thinking, there is no way I am reporting my biggest client to a government enforcer. I would lose all my future work.
Right, the fear of retaliation.
Exactly. Even if it isn't a court case, nobody wants to be known as the whistleblower who reported their biggest buyer to a regulator. Will smaller suppliers actually use this?
Well, what stands out here is that the commissioner's power to investigate means enforcement doesn't always have to rely on a single, terrified supplier acting as a whistleblower.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the regulator can run systemic audits. If they receive intelligence or spot anomalies, they can look at a large company's entire supply chain. They can identify persistent poor practices across thousands of invoices and take action based on a pattern of behavior. This shifts the burden of enforcement away from the individual small business and turns it into a broader regulatory audit.
That makes a lot of sense. It turns it into a structural issue rather than an individual grievance. But, businesses are incredibly creative when it comes to keeping their cash.
They certainly are.
Even with an enforcer and a 60-day rule, buyers find ways to stop the clock. It is like playing a game of chess where one player is allowed to pause the timer indefinitely just by saying, wait, your pawn isn't perfectly centered on its square.
Right, they find a technicality.
Yeah, exactly. You reach day 59, and suddenly the buyer says, oh, the project reference number on line 4 is formatted incorrectly. We are disputing this invoice. Please reissue it. And suddenly the clock starts all over again. How does the legislation stop that?
The intended rules systematically shut down those specific invoice stalling maneuvers by proposing a strict statutory deadline for disputing invoices.
So a defined time limit.
Yes, it establishes a defined window for the buyer to raise any issues. If a buyer wants to query a project reference number or dispute the quality of the goods, they must do so within that specific window.
Okay.
If they fail to raise a dispute before the deadline and then try to pause the payment clock on day 59, they may have to pay compensation to the supplier.
It is a bit like a strict return policy at a retail store.
That is a perfect way to put it.
You have a window to check the goods, raise the issue, and if you miss it, you own it, and you owe the money.
And just like a strict return policy, it forces the buyer to fix their own internal processing. If their accounts payable department is disorganized and takes 5 weeks to review an invoice, that inefficiency is now their financial problem.
Not the suppliers?
Right. Furthermore, the government intends to make statutory interest mandatory. All commercial contracts will carry a mandatory right to statutory interest at 8% above the Bank of England base rate.
Wait, if the base rate is around 5%, we're talking about a 13% penalty.
It's credit card territory, yeah.
That turns late payment into a very expensive form of borrowing. But I am assuming corporate lawyers have historically found a way around this. They probably just bury a clause on page 40 of a standard contract that says something like, both parties agree that late fees are capped at 0.5%.
And the small supplier, desperate for the work, just has to swallow it.
Exactly.
You are describing what is legally termed an alternative remedy. Currently, a large corporation with immense legal resources can draft a commercial contract that includes exactly that kind of clause. The small supplier signs the contract, legally agreeing to an alternative remedy and entirely bypassing the statutory rate.
Because that is where the math dictates corporate behavior?
Yes. If a multinational sits on 50 million pounds of unpaid invoices, and the agreed penalty is only 0.5%, but they can earn 5% by keeping that cash in their own accounts, paying late is a highly profitable strategy.
So they contractually sign away the supplier's right to a meaningful penalty, turning a systemic delay into a net profit for the buyer.
Right. By making the 8% above base rate mandatory, the legislation completely removes the ability for parties to agree on an alternative remedy.
Wow.
It ensures that big businesses cannot simply lawyer their way out of the penalty. It guarantees that the financial consequence for late payment remains uniformly punitive across all commercial contracts, destroying the arbitrage model that makes late payment profitable in the first place.
Okay, so we have the 60-day limit, The Small Business Commissioner acting as the enforcer, the statutory deadline for the chess clock disputes, and mandatory unwaivable interest.
Which covers the direct operational and financial penalties, yeah.
Right. But there is another angle here that targets the very top of the corporate structure.
Okay.
They want to drag this issue out of the accounting basement and drop it right onto the boardroom table.
The intention is to target corporate leadership directly through new transparency rules. Boards or audit committees of persistently late-paying large companies will be legally required to publish commentary on their payment performance.
They will have to publicly explain why their performance is poor.
Yes, and exactly what steps they are taking to fix it. Additionally, they may need to report the exact amount of statutory interest they were liable to pay versus the amount they actually paid.
So what does this all mean? Are we hoping that an embarrassing line item in an annual report will suddenly give corporate boards a conscience? Because historically, reputational embarrassment only works if shareholders care, and shareholders usually care about profit margins.
Well, it is not about relying on a corporate conscience. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at how an audit committee functions. An audit committee is acutely sensitive to compliance and regulatory risk.
Right.
When a company is forced to publicly document massive liabilities and statutory interest, they are creating a highly visible, legally mandated paper trail. This data becomes actionable.
Actionable by the Small Business Commissioner.
Exactly. The regulator no longer has to wait for a small supplier to complain. They can simply read the mandatory annual reports of large corporations, identify the persistent offenders based on their own published liabilities, and launch an investigation using the company's own admissions.
It creates a self-incriminating mechanism for bad actors.
It does. This moves the focus from simply recovering money after a problem occurs to proactively forcing a change in corporate payment culture from the top down. If you abuse the supply chain, you have to publish the math proving you abused it, which then invites the regulator to fine you.
It is a very systematic approach to accountability. Let's look at the scope of all this and what happens next. Where does this apply and when?
The policy is intended to apply across the entire UK. The consultation phase actually received 867 responses from businesses and industry bodies.
Highlighting how widespread the friction is across all sectors?
Exactly. To ensure everything functions smoothly across borders, the government is working with Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland through the Late Payment Common Framework to maintain regulatory alignment.
So there won't be a loophole where a company headquartered in London routes its accounts payable through a subsidiary office in Edinburgh to bypass the 60-day rule.
Right, or the mandatory interest. The goal of the Common Framework is to prevent exactly that kind of jurisdictional arbitrage. However, we have to remember the roadmap here.
Which is?
Implementing these changes requires both primary and secondary legislation. The government has stated it will legislate as soon as parliamentary time allows. This involves navigating the standard legislative schedule, debates, and drafting processes.
For anyone working in credit control, debt collection, or commercial recovery, the direction of travel is unmistakable. We're looking at tougher rules, stronger enforcement, and unignorable pressure on businesses that continue to pay late.
Oh, definitely.
Think about your own dunning process. This completely changes how credit risk might be managed in the future and how recovery professionals will need to position their services when court action is no longer the default escalation point.
The entire landscape of commercial debt recovery will evolve to adapt to these new statutory mechanisms. The role of a credit controller shifts from constantly chasing overdue payments to managing compliance with these new statutory timelines and leveraging the threat of the commissioner.
Which brings up a final thought to consider for you listening. With the government providing all these new, robust statutory levers to guarantee payment, will we see an entirely new dynamic emerge in commercial negotiations?
That is the big question.
Right. Could the mere threat of a small business commissioner investigation become a standard, unspoken part of doing business? Or, in response to these strict post-invoicing rules, will large corporate buyers simply invent new ways to dictate brutal terms before an invoice is ever even generated?
Like perhaps by demanding aggressively lower initial prices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or extending the periods required for project acceptance before they even allow the supplier to submit the invoice. It is a question of whether the friction simply moves from the accounts payable department to the procurement department.
Regulatory action always prompts a reaction in the market. How large buyers adapt their procurement strategies to offset these new mandatory payment rules will be the next major development to watch.
Something to keep a very close eye on as these intended rules move through Parliament. Thank you for joining us to connect the dots on this. If your business relies on healthy cash flow, this policy update is definitely one to track.